The question hung in the air like a live wire, crackling with the weight of centuries. The room, with its heavy, velvet curtains drawn tight, felt as if it were holding its breath. It was late afternoon, but the sun barely penetrated the thick atmosphere of the place. In the corner, an old grandfather clock ticked in a slow, deliberate rhythm, its hands moving with the weight of inevitability. It had all started with that one simple question, tossed into the room by a reporter, her voice trembling slightly, as if she, too, feared the answer. "Mr. Trump, can you tell us who really rules the world?" The question wasn't meant to be political, but the way it resonated throughout the room made it feel as though the walls themselves were trembling in response. Everyone knew that Trump was never one to shy away from a bold statement. But what came next left even the seasoned reporters, hardened by years of dealing with high-profile personalities, momentarily speechless. Without missing a beat, Donald Trump leaned forward in his chair, his eyes narrowing as if he were about to deliver a great revelation. His fingers, resting on the polished wood of the table, twitched slightly, as if they were ready to draw the outlines of a grand conspiracy. "The world," he began, voice steady, "is not governed by governments or any of the institutions you see on TV. It's controlled by something far more secretive, far more powerful than you could ever imagine." His eyes swept the room, locking on the faces of the reporters who, though experienced, seemed unsure how to process what they were hearing. "There's a group, a society, really, that has been pulling the strings for centuries. They're known as the League of the Cartel Gates." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The words hung there, thick and heavy, but nobody dared to speak. Trump continued, unfazed by the stunned silence. "This group is more than just a powerful conglomerate, more than just a network of the rich and influential. No, they have deeper connections, rooted in the very foundations of history. They are the ones who control the flow of information, manipulate public opinion, even influence what you think is reality." The room had gone completely still, each person locked in disbelief. The reporter who had asked the question opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was frozen in place, unsure if this was some kind of joke or if she was about to witness a confession that could rewrite the course of history. Trump paused, his gaze lingering over the stunned faces of those in the room, before he leaned back in his chair, a sly smile curling on his lips. "I'm telling you," he said with a quiet finality, "they've been behind every major event, every turning point in history. Wars, revolutions, economic crashes, everything. And they'll continue to do so for as long as they can." The room remained silent for what felt like an eternity. And in that silence, something profound began to take shape. A dark, looming realization that perhaps, just perhaps, the world they had always known wasn't the reality at all. That night, after the press conference ended and the reporters had left, something shifted in the air. The word League of the Cartel Gates spread like wildfire, but it wasn't just in the papers or on the news. People began whispering about it, trying to make sense of Trump's words. Some dismissed it as paranoia, others as a conspiracy theory, but a small, increasingly vocal group of people took it seriously. They began digging into the history of this shadowy organization, searching for any trace that might confirm or deny Trump's claim. Meanwhile, Trump's words continued to echo in the minds of two men, Artem Shulgin, an archaeologist, and Nikolai Sorokin, a former political analyst turned conspiracy theorist. Neither of them had anticipated that this statement, made in such a seemingly casual manner, would open the door to an ancient mystery that had been hidden from the world for centuries. Neither knew where this journey would take them, but they both understood one thing. The League of the Cartel Gates was not just a name. It was the key to understanding something much greater, something far more dangerous than anyone could possibly imagine. The moment Artem Shulgin walked into the small, dimly lit room, he knew there was no going back. The papers on the desk in front of him, the half-filled mug of stale coffee, the faint hum of the air conditioning, it all felt surreal, like a stage set for a play whose ending had already been written. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the stack of documents that had come in just hours before. They had been sent anonymously, but there was no mistaking the significance of what lay inside. Artem had always been one to chase after the unknown. It was his nature, his obsession, and the very thing that had kept him going in a career that had long ceased to be rewarding. But this was different. What he was about to discover, or what he thought he might discover, was bigger than any academic pursuit or archaeological discovery. This was something far more dangerous. He unfolded the first page. The handwriting was shaky, as if the writer had been rushed, yet deliberate, every word carefully chosen. It was a letter addressed to someone Artem didn't know, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the message. The League knows you are close. If you wish to survive, stop digging. If you don't, you'll end up like the others. The others. Artem had heard whispers, rumors, tales of people who had gone too far, people who had tried to expose the League of the Cartel Gates and had disappeared without a trace. But Artem had never believed it. He had thought they were simply the paranoid ramblings of people who couldn't comprehend the depths of the world they lived in. Now, however, it seemed as though reality was far darker than he had ever imagined. His thoughts were interrupted by the buzzing of his phone. It was Nikolai Sorokin, a man whose name had become almost synonymous with conspiracy theories. They had met by chance a few months ago, both of them investigating similar leads, both unaware of how intertwined their fates would become. What started as an exchange of theories had quickly evolved into something much more personal, much more urgent. And now, it seemed as though everything they had worked toward was beginning to unravel. Artem, Nikolai's voice crackled through the line, filled with the unmistakable weight of concern. We need to talk. I've found something big, something they don't want us to see. Artem's heart raced. What did you find? It's the League. I've traced their roots back to the very founding of civilization itself. I've found evidence, concrete evidence, that they've been involved in every major event in history. Wars, revolutions, economic crises, it's all them. They've been pulling the strings for centuries. Artem sat back, his mind reeling. This isn't possible. It's a conspiracy, Nikolai. There's no way they could have that much control over everything. I thought the same thing, Nikolai replied, his voice tense. But I've seen it. I've seen the evidence with my own eyes. They're not just manipulating politics or economics. They're manipulating everything. The very fabric of reality itself. History, culture, even the way people think. It's all part of their plan. And we're getting too close. Artem stood up, pacing the small room. We can't stop now. We're so close. If we back off now, we'll never know the truth. I don't know if the truth is worth it anymore. Nikolai's voice faltered. You don't understand, Artem. I've been threatened. I've been followed. And I know you have too. This is bigger than us. The League doesn't want anyone to know what they really are, what they've really done. And if we keep going, we won't just expose them. We'll become their next target. Artem was silent for a moment, the weight of Nikolai's words sinking in. He had suspected something all along, but now that it was staring him in the face, he couldn't turn away. The League of the Cartel Gates was not just an organization of shadowy figures. It was a force that had shaped the course of human history, and it was still shaping it. I don't care, Artem said finally, his voice resolute. We've come this far. We have to finish what we started. Nikolai's voice softened. I knew you'd say that. But be careful, Artem. There's more to this than you realize. Much more. Before Artem could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone for a long moment, the silence on the other end echoing like a warning. But there was no going back now. He had made his choice. The next day, Artem boarded a flight to Moscow to meet with Nikolai. They had decided to combine their findings, to share everything they had learned and see where it would take them. The truth, they both knew, was hiding in plain sight. And the more they uncovered, the more they realized that the League's influence ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Nikolai's apartment was small but cluttered with books, papers, and maps, a testament to his obsession with uncovering the truth, no matter the cost. He was already waiting for Artem at the door when he arrived, his face pale and drawn, as if he hadn't slept in days. I've been thinking about it, Nikolai said without preamble as they sat down at his table. We're not just dealing with an organization. We're dealing with something far older, far more powerful than we can imagine. Artem nodded, his mind still reeling from their conversation the night before. I know, but we can't stop now. We have to keep going. The League, whatever they are, they've been here for centuries, controlling the world from the shadows. And if we stop now, they'll win. Nikolai's eyes flashed with a mixture of fear and determination. They already won, Artem. But maybe, just maybe, we could take them down? As the two men pored over their research, it became clear that their investigation was no longer just about exposing the League. They had uncovered something much more disturbing, a pattern, a blueprint for how the League had influenced not only history, but the very way humanity thought and behaved. Every major conflict, every shift in power, every revolution, all of it had been carefully orchestrated by the League. And now, it seemed, the time had come for them to complete their grand design. But what was the true nature of the League? What were they trying to achieve? And most importantly, what would happen if Artem and Nikolai succeeded in their quest for the truth? As they pieced together the fragments of the past, they realized they were no longer just researchers. They had become players in a much larger game, one that they had only begun to understand. And with each step they took, the world they knew seemed to slip further and further from their grasp. The darkness of the night seemed to settle deeper with every passing hour, as Artem and Nikolai delved further into their investigation. They had begun piecing together fragments of history, each one linking back to the mysterious League of the Cartel Gates. But the more they uncovered, the more they realized that the truth they were searching for was something entirely different from what they had imagined. They had already traced the League's involvement in key historical events, wars, economic crashes, and revolutions. But now they were beginning to understand that the League's influence extended far beyond politics and economics. It was woven into the very fabric of society, culture, and even the way people perceive the world. In the quiet solitude of Nikolai's apartment, surrounded by piles of ancient texts and confidential documents, Artem couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn into a web from which there would be no escape. He had always been a man of reason, a scholar who sought to uncover facts, but now, as the evidence began to mount, it felt as though reason itself was slipping away. "Look at this," Nikolai said, his voice low but urgent. He was staring at a series of photographs spread across the table. Artem walked over, his heart pounding as he looked at the images. They were old, some dating back to the early 20th century, others from much earlier. Each one showed the same group of people, dressed in different periods' attire, but always the same faces, always the same enigmatic presence. In one photo, they stood on the steps of a building during a major political rally. In another, they were seated at a table discussing something with world leaders. They appeared to be everywhere in every moment of history. "The League," Artem whispered. It was the only explanation that made sense. Nikolai nodded. "They've always been there, hidden in plain sight. These are the people who shaped history, who made decisions that changed the world. And they did it all from behind the scenes." Artem's mind was reeling. He had suspected that there was something more to the League than met the eye. But this was beyond anything he could have imagined. The idea that these individuals had been manipulating world events for centuries was terrifying enough. But to think that they had been involved in every major turning point in human history, it felt like the foundation of everything he knew was crumbling beneath him. "What are we supposed to do with this?" Artem asked, feeling a sense of helplessness creeping in. "If they've been in control for so long, how can we possibly stop them?" Nikolai stood up abruptly, pacing across the room as he spoke. "We don't stop them. We expose them. We show the world who they are, what they've been doing all this time. People need to know. The world has been living a lie." Artem shook his head. "And then what? If we expose them, they'll just come after us. You saw what happened to those who got too close. There's no way we can fight back against an organization like this." Nikolai stopped pacing and looked at Artem with a fierce intensity in his eyes. "Maybe we don't fight them. Maybe we just make sure they can't hide anymore. If people know the truth, maybe they'll start asking questions. Maybe they'll start to see the world for what it really is." Artem was silent for a moment, considering Nikolai's words. He had always been a man of action, of doing what was necessary, but this was different. Exposing the League wasn't just about unveiling the truth. It was about exposing a power that had shaped the very reality people lived in. The ramifications were unimaginable. "We're already in this," Artem said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "We can't back out now, but we need to be careful. If they're watching us, we can't afford to make any mistakes." Nikolai gave a grim smile. "No mistakes. But we'll need more. We need someone on the inside. Someone who can help us? Someone who knows what they're dealing with," Artem agreed. He paused for a moment, then spoke again, more quietly this time. "Do you think there's anyone who can help us, Nikolai? Anyone who can take us to them?" Nikolai looked hesitant, but after a beat he nodded. "I think I know someone, but I'm not sure they'll be willing to talk. Whoever's part of the League is deep in it. They don't just hand over information like that." "Well, we have to try," Artem said, standing up. "If there's even a chance of getting inside, we have to take it." Nikolai looked at him with a mix of determination and doubt. "All right, I'll make the call, but we need to be ready for anything." As the two men prepared to take the next step in their dangerous quest for truth, they knew one thing for certain. The deeper they went, the more they would risk losing themselves. The League had its eyes on them now, and they had no idea what the consequences would be if they failed. But failure wasn't an option. They had already seen too much. The next morning, Nikolai took Artem to meet someone who could help them, an old colleague, a former government agent named Alexei Petrov, who had been involved in intelligence operations years earlier. Petrov had disappeared from the public eye after a scandal involving corruption, and now lived in hiding, his whereabouts known only to a few trusted individuals. When they arrived at his apartment, it was clear that Petrov wasn't someone who trusted easily. His home was Spartan, his demeanor cold and calculating. He didn't speak much at first, simply offering them a seat before pouring 3 cups of strong coffee. The silence hung between them like a thick fog, neither Artem nor Nikolai daring to speak until Petrov did. "So," Petrov said finally, his voice low and gravelly, "you want to know about the League." "Why?" Nikolai glanced at Artem before speaking. "Because we've seen the signs. We know they've been involved in every major event in history, and we need to know how far their influence reaches. We need the truth." Petrov studied them for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to measure their resolve. Finally, he sighed. "I don't know if you're ready for this. The League is not something you can just uncover and walk away from. Once you go down this path, there's no turning back." Artem felt his stomach tighten. The weight of Petrov's words settled heavily on him. "We're already down this path. We need to know what they're planning, and how we can stop it." Petrov stared at them both for a long time, then slowly nodded. "All right, I'll tell you what I know. But be warned, it's not going to be easy." As Petrov began to speak, the truth began to unfold, a truth darker than anything Artem and Nikolai had ever imagined. The League was not just an organization. It was a network of power, of wealth, of minds far older than anyone could comprehend. And its reach was limitless. But the most chilling revelation was yet to come. The air inside Petrov's apartment was thick with tension. Every word spoken seemed to carry a weight greater than the one before it, like a ticking clock winding closer to an inevitable moment of reckoning. Artem and Nikolai sat in silence as the former agent slowly unfolded the tangled web that was the League of the Cartel Gates. "Do you understand what you're asking?" Petrov finally broke the silence, his voice steady but layered with a warning. "The League is more than an organization. It's a force, a network that goes far beyond simple politics or economics. Its influence stretches across the entire globe, reaching into every facet of society. Governments, corporations, media, even religion. They control it all." Artem leaned forward, his heart racing. "What are they after? What do they want?" Petrov paused, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. "Power, of course. But it's more than that. It's about control. Control over how people think, how they act, how they perceive the world around them. The League doesn't just want to own the world. They want to shape the very nature of reality itself." Nikolai's voice was sharp with disbelief. "Shape reality? How is that even possible?" Petrov met his gaze. "Through the manipulation of information, through the control of perception. They've spent centuries refining their methods. They don't just influence what happens in the world. They control how people see the world. History is written not by the victors, but by those who control the narrative. Artem felt a chill run through him. He had suspected that there was something much deeper behind the League's power, but hearing it laid out so plainly was unsettling. So, they've been doing this for centuries. But how? What's their mechanism? Petrov stood up abruptly and walked to a bookshelf filled with thick, leather-bound volumes. He pulled out a heavy book, its pages yellowed with age, and placed it on the table in front of them. This, he said, tapping the cover, is a key to their power. It's an ancient manuscript, one that dates back to the early days of the League's formation. It's a guide of sorts to the principles they've used to maintain their grip on the world. Not just wealth or political influence, but something much more subtle. The ability to shape thought, to control belief, to manufacture reality. Artem's eyes widened as he flipped through the book, its pages filled with esoteric symbols and cryptic text. What is this? A religious text? Petrov shook his head. It's much older than that. It predates organized religion. This manuscript is based on principles of human perception, psychological manipulation, and social control. It's the foundation of the League's power. Nikolai frowned, clearly disturbed. So they've been using this book to control the course of history? Not just this book, Petrov replied. They've evolved their methods over time. The manuscript was only the beginning. Now they have entire networks, media empires, think tanks, secret societies, all working to maintain their control. But it's not just about power anymore. It's about something far darker. Artem looked up sharply. What do you mean? Petrov's face darkened. The League has always operated in the shadows, but now they're preparing for something more ambitious. They're not just content with controlling what people think. They're planning to alter how people perceive reality itself. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence hung heavily in the room, each of them processing the gravity of Petrov's words. What could be worse than controlling thought? What kind of power could shape reality itself? Artem was the first to break the silence. How do we stop them? If they're already this deep, what's left to do? Petrov's eyes flickered with something close to regret. I don't know, but I can tell you this. They've already started. Their plan is in motion, and we're all just puppets waiting for the strings to be pulled. Suddenly, a sharp knock echoed through the apartment. The three men froze, exchanging wary glances. Petrov immediately rose, his expression tense. He motioned for them to stay silent as he approached the door. Through the peephole, he could see nothing but shadows, but his instinct screamed that something was wrong. Slowly, he opened the door. It was a courier, a nondescript man in a plain suit, holding an envelope sealed with an unfamiliar emblem. He passed it without a word, and the door clicked shut behind him. Petrov hesitated, then tore open the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper with a short message. You're too close. Stop now, or suffer the consequences. A shiver ran down Artem's spine. It was the first direct threat they had received, but it was not the first sign of danger. The League was watching them, and they were not going to let anyone uncover the truth without a fight. We've got to move, Petrov muttered, his face pale. They know we're onto them. We can't stay here. Artem stood up quickly. What's the next step? Petrov looked them both in the eye, his voice low. The only way to stop the League is to break their hold on reality itself. We need to find the source of their power, the thing that allows them to shape perception, to control minds. Without it, they're just another organization, another group of powerful men. But with it, they're gods. Nikolai and Artem exchanged uneasy glances. Where do we start? Artem asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Petrov sighed. We start by going after their roots. The League didn't just appear out of nowhere. It has a beginning, a foundation. If we find that, we might be able to undo what they've done. But the question was no longer simple. How far back would they have to go? And what kind of power would they be dealing with once they found the answers? The further they dug, the more they would discover. But they would also be digging themselves into a hole that might very well be their grave. That night, as they left Petrov's apartment and disappeared into the shadows of the city, the weight of the task ahead of them settled over them like a dark cloud. There was no turning back. The League had already made it clear that they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But Artem and Nikolai had come too far to turn back now. The world, as they knew it, was no longer the world they had once believed in. The deeper they sank into the heart of this conspiracy, the more they realized that they were not just fighting the League. They were fighting the very fabric of reality itself. The cold, early morning air bit at their skin as Artem, Nikolai, and Petrov left the safety of the apartment. The city, still cloaked in the haze of dawn, seemed eerily quiet, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something. The knowledge that they were being hunted, that the League's unseen eyes were upon them, added a weight to the atmosphere that made every shadow seem like a potential threat. The plan, such as it was simple. They had to follow the thread of the League's origins, trace its roots back to its inception. Petrov had provided them with the name of someone who might have answers, an elusive figure who had once been at the heart of the League's inner circle, but who had vanished years ago under mysterious circumstances. Finding him was their best shot at uncovering the truth, and, if they were lucky, finding the source of the League's power. As they walked through the deserted streets, Artem couldn't help but feel the weight of the world pressing in on him. It was as if reality itself had begun to crack, revealing something darker beneath the surface. The more they uncovered, the more he realized how little he truly understood about the world around him. The League wasn't just some shadowy organization. It was the architect of everything he had ever known. "Do you really think this man can help us?" Nikolai's voice was tight, laced with both hope and skepticism. "I don't know," Petrov replied, his eyes scanning the street ahead. "But he's the only lead we have. We'll have to move quickly. The longer we stay exposed, the more dangerous it gets." They reached a small, inconspicuous building hidden in a side street, its windows shuttered and its door reinforced with metal bars. The building seemed out of place, as if it didn't quite belong in the city, a relic from a time long past, a time before the League had cemented its control over the modern world. Petrov knocked 3 times on the door, a rhythm that seemed to echo through the narrow alley. After a long moment, the door creaked open slightly, revealing a pair of tired eyes peering out from the shadows. "You're late," a voice said, hoarse and filled with distrust. "It wasn't safe," Petrov muttered, stepping into the building. The others followed him, closing the door behind them. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a flickering lamp in the corner. The man standing before them was older than they had imagined, his face weathered and pale, his eyes sunken as though he hadn't seen daylight in years. "Viktor Ivanov," Petrov said, introducing the man. "This is the one I told you about. He used to be a high-ranking member of the League." Ivanov didn't say anything at first. Instead, he studied them with a level of scrutiny that made Artem feel as if he were being measured, weighed, and found wanting. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and rasping. "So, you're the ones poking around where you don't belong," Ivanov muttered, "trying to unearth things that have been buried for a reason. You should have stayed away." "We don't have a choice," Nikolai said, his voice firm. "The League is manipulating everything, controlling history, shaping reality. We need to know how they do it, and why." Ivanov chuckled bitterly. "You think you can stop them? You're chasing ghosts, my friends. The League has been manipulating the world for so long that it's become the world. Their power is like air, invisible, all-encompassing, and deadly." Artem felt his pulse quicken. "But there has to be a way to stop them, a way to break their hold." Ivanov's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Artem thought he saw a flicker of something. Regret, fear, perhaps even hope, but it quickly vanished, replaced by a cold indifference. "You don't understand," Ivanov said quietly. "The League's power isn't just political or economic. It's metaphysical. They control perception. They control belief. And once you've learned to control belief, you've learned to control everything." Petrov stepped forward, his tone growing more urgent. "How do we break it? How do we find the source of their power?" Ivanov studied them for a long moment before answering, as though deciding whether or not to trust them. Finally, he spoke, his voice almost a whisper. "There's an artifact," he said, his words carrying the weight of something ancient. "An object that the League has guarded for centuries. It's the source of their power. the thing that allows them to bend reality to their will. Artem's heart raced. Where is it? Ivanov shook his head. That's the problem. The artifact isn't a place or an object that you can find easily. It's something hidden within the fabric of the world itself. A location that shifts, a concept that changes depending on the way you perceive it. The artifact is reality itself? Nikolai asked, his voice incredulous. Ivanov nodded. In a way, the League has learned to manipulate the very structure of perception, to make reality conform to their desires. And they've used the artifact to make this possible. Artem felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under him. But how can we find it? How do we even begin to look for something that doesn't exist in one place or another? Ivanov's eyes gleamed with a strange, knowing light. You have to break the rules. You have to step outside the illusion they've created. You have to unlearn everything you think you know about the world. Only then will you be able to see it. Petrov grunted in frustration. That's not helpful. We need a concrete lead. A place, a name, anything. There are no leads, Ivanov said with a bitter laugh. The League's power lies in your inability to see it. But if you're determined to keep going, then I suggest you start with the Dreaming City. The Dreaming City? Artem asked, his brow furrowing. What is that? It's a place, Ivanov replied, his voice low and filled with dread. A place that exists outside of the normal world. A place where reality bends and twists. If the League's artifact exists anywhere, it's there. But be warned, entering the Dreaming City is not like stepping into any other place. It's a labyrinth, and once you enter, you may never come out. The room fell silent. Artem felt as though a wave of cold had swept over him, freezing him in place. The Dreaming City. It sounded like a myth, an impossible place that could never exist. But Ivanov's words had the ring of truth. The League had manipulated reality for centuries. Perhaps a place like the Dreaming City wasn't so impossible after all. If we go there, Nikolai said slowly, how do we know we'll survive? Ivanov met his gaze, his expression grim. You don't. But if you want to stop the League, it's the only place you can go. And if you don't go now, you'll never get another chance. With that, Ivanov turned and disappeared into the shadows of his darkened apartment, leaving Artem and Nikolai standing in stunned silence. The next few days were a blur. The more they researched, the more the Dreaming City seemed to fade in and out of reality, like a fleeting mirage. But there was one thing they all knew. They had no choice. The League was closer than ever, and if they were going to stop it, they would have to enter the heart of the illusion itself. With their destination set, the time for hesitation had passed. It was no longer a question of whether they could stop the League, but whether they would make it out alive. If they made it out at all, the edge of reality was within their reach. But the moment they crossed it, there would be no turning back.